using simple materials and no technology to make handmade dollhouse miniatures. I'm making a combination blackboard and corkboard to fill the space above the desk in the abandoned lab. I cut a piece of cereal box to the appropriate size, and I'm adding a frame using some scraps from miniature kits. Most of the bulletin board will be cork, but I'm making a small section of chalkboard on the right. I got my thin adhesive cork from Amazon, but you can get a similar product from the Dollar Tree. I'm using more thin wood scraps for the interior frame pieces. I'll glue down the cork in the blackboard once I finish the frame. I'm keeping it really simple by using a marker to color this frame, and to age it a bit, I'm going over the whole thing with a light dry brushing of ivory paint. Dry brushing is often used to highlight details, but I also like to use it to subdue colors and make something look older and faded. I am attaching the black construction paper with white glue. I removed the protective backing from the corkboard and stuck it down with its own adhesive. Before pressing the corkboard down, I'm sliding it around to get it in the right position. The corkboard looks brand new, so I'm dry brushing that as well as the chalkboard. I want the chalkboard to look like someone has erased it and left some chalk residue behind. I googled chalkboard science to get some ideas of things I can draw on the chalkboard. For every project I do, I Google reference images because it helps my creativity and gives me ideas. One day I wasn't feeling very creative, but I still wanted to do something for my miniature hobby. So I printed out a bunch of Etsy files, cut them out, and colored the edges with marker. So now on a day like today, when I'm creative and the ideas are flowing, I can just add these pieces to my work instead of having to stop to do a time-consuming, tedious task. It may seem like I'm attaching paper at random, but I wanted to add the water-damaged pieces at the bottom and mix in a couple varieties of subdued colors and pattern. I'm adding a dot of glue anywhere there would be a thumbtack. You can cut the head off a pin, but I'm using tiny caviar beads that are meant for decorating your fingernails. I chose red so they'll stand out, and I added some extra caviar beads off to the left to look like thumbtacks that haven't been used yet. To make it look like this doctor or scientist ran out of space, I added some more notes to the right of it. I'm making a tiny piece of chalk using this polystyrene rod I got from my local hobby store. You could also use painted wire, but I like to support local stores. I'm resting the tiny piece of chalk on the wooden frame. I looked up a reference image to make a 1950s style chalkboard eraser, which looks pretty similar to modern ones. I made a guess at the size and used some sandpaper to round the edges. I'm keeping it really simple and using coffee stir stick for the top. Before I glue them together, I'm giving them some color with a few layers of paint. I'm coloring them before assembly to eliminate the risk of pale glue spots and also to avoid having to wait for the glue to dry before painting. Someone gifted me a bunch of this felt, which is great to use for making miniature carpet. I'm using it to make the eraser portion of the eraser. I used tacky glue to attach the felt so I can trim it to size right away. I received a lot of great viewer suggestions, so I'm adding final details to the abandoned miniature lab in a book. I'm making a light switch, and I really love the look of this 1950s version. I have these grommets that can be used in scrapbooking. I'm cutting off the tabs to make them look like the circles that go around the switches. I'm using a skinny stick as the metal backplate for the light switch. I'm replicating the raised portion of the metal using a bit of scrap cardstock. I'm using scissors that are entirely too big to cut a tiny semicircle from each corner for the screw holes. I really wanted to replicate the tiny flathead screws, and I came up with a great method. I'm using this cheap precision tip bottle from Amazon to add a little dot to each corner, but you could also apply this little dab with a toothpick. I used a hair dryer to form a skin so the surface is dry. Using the thin blade of my craft knife, I'm pressing down and creating a line for the center of the screw. This will be easier to see when I paint it. The switch I'm copying has 8 switches, but I think that would be excessive for this small space, so I'm only making 3. I've been able to fit a lot into this 1/12 scale diorama, but the book is only 2 1/4 inches deep. I'm using paperclip to make the switches. I cut all 3 pieces of paperclip, but once I started adding them, I realized they were too long. I should have cut one first and tested the length before cutting all 3. I'm attaching newly cut shorter pieces of paperclip using white glue. I'm positioning 2 of the switches in the on position and 1 in the off position. I kept the switches intentionally too short because I'm adding more detail on the end using these caviar beads that are intended for decorating fingernails. I used more white glue and added a tiny bead to the end of each switch. I'm adding the first layer of color and also helping keep all of these pieces together with a mixture of brown paint and Mod Podge. I want the metal to look old and tarnished, so I'm mixing a bit of copper with bronze. I'm retaining a lot of the brown base coat by dry brushing the metallic tone. I'm adding a wash to the surface using black acrylic paint mixed with rubbing alcohol. This will look a lot more subtle as it dries, and it'll make the metal look tarnished and old. To further highlight the details, I'm dry brushing a very thin layer of silver. The silver really brought it over the top and emphasized the teeny tiny screws in every corner. I hope you can see these because they look so cool in real life. I'm gluing the switch to the right side of the room and making more miniature accessories for the abandoned lab inside of a book. I'm making a light fixture to mount under the shelf, and I want to keep it simple. I keep the solo cup of wooden scrap pieces near my desk, and I'm using this little piece of trim to make the light fixture. I think it's a little bit too long, so I cut a small amount off of the end. I chose this piece of trim because it's shaped like a U, so it already has a top, a back, and a front. I'm using some scraps of cardstock to make the ends. My patience allowed the glue to dry for 2 minutes before cutting off the excess paper. I want this light fixture to look really smooth like metal. I could have used the wood glue trick to make it look really smooth, but then I would have to wait for it to dry, so I'm using some spackle in the ends where the paper meets and to fill the wood grain. I'm covering up the bottom with the plastic, but I think it'll look too dark in there if I don't paint it first. The paint raised the wood grain, so I'm repeating the steps. Full-size wood grain on a metal light fixture would affect the realism in my diorama. I'm using plastic from old packaging as the glass. I chose this plastic because it makes things look blurry from a distance, but up close it's too see-through. I'm using a bit of Mod Podge and sprinkling on some black caviar beads. I'm sealing it with white glue so it'll dry clear and putting it under a 1-2-3 block. Make sure you don't use super glue because it could make the plastic cloudy and you won't see your beads. The caviar beads look like dead flies and I love it. I sealed the light fixture with gloss Mod Podge, and I'm stippling on some brown chalk pastels to see if I like the effect on the wet Mod Podge. I tested the technique on the back and used less when adding it to the sides and the front. I always wear a mask when I'm working with chalk pastels because the tiny particles get in the air. To make an easy light switch, I'm using this broken plastic switch that's meant for a 1/12 scale dollhouse. I'm cutting off all of the edges so I can use just the switch on my light fixture. I don't want to obscure the details of the light switch by painting it black, so I'm painting it dark yellow. This makes it look like plastic that has aged over the years from UV light exposure. I almost made it an entire video without using my dirty down rust. I'm adding it to the edges where the pieces of metal would meet one another. This light fixture will be mounted under the shelf, so I'm adding a fake shadow using some black chalk pastels. This looks a little strange now, but once it's under the cabinet, it looks awesome. I'm adding a thin line of rust around the entire top of the light fixture. I did this after the chalk pastel because I think the chalk pastel would change the color and texture of the rust. I made a simple electrical cord with some paper, paint, and thread. I'm making a simple box to fill this empty space. I cut a scrap piece of wood so it's about the same size as an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper in 1/12 scale. I'm gluing it to a paper bag, making sure there's enough overhang to wrap around the edges. Instead of wrapping this block like a present, I'm trying a different technique so I don't have any visible seams or folds. I pushed the sides in, pinched the corners, and added glue to the edges. I did this on all 4 sides, so I end up with this tab hanging off of each corner. Without waiting for the glue to dry, I'm cutting off all of the tabs. Since the paper is wet from the glue, rolling the corners on the table gets rid of the seams. Now I'm making a simple lid. The paper bag is really flimsy, so I'm using some scrap cardstock to give it some structure. I cut the cardstock to be the same size as the top of the box, and now I'm folding in all of the paper edges. This lid will be similar to a shoebox, so I'm gluing some strips around the edges, but I want to make sure there's space for the lid to fold. I glued 4 strips, leaving a tiny gap between the strips and the top of the lid. I'm cutting a tab at the 2 short ends so I can fold it under and glue it. Making the box this way helped me avoid measuring and planning, which are my 2 least favorite things. To make the box more interesting, I'm gluing the lid on crooked and adding some papers inside. This is 1/12 scale office paperwork, but I accidentally printed it extremely tiny, so I'm using it to look like receipts or notes inside of this box. One of the downsides to using a wooden block as the base is the box looks really perfect. To make it look older and fit in with this abandoned space, I dented the lid. I'm using some watered down black paint to make it look like there's water damage at the bottom of the box. Check out the description to see the rest of the abandoned lab project, but now I'm moving on to my miniature shed build. Learn to make a miniature shed from scratch and fill it with handmade accessories without using a printer or any other technology. Display it in a potted plant or your dollhouse backyard. I made a couple prototypes using paper. I think the shed on the left will show off the contents a bit better, so I'm dismantling it and using the pieces to make a pattern. I made it using shiny paper and hot glue, so it's easy to take apart. I cut out 5 pieces in total and covered them with wax paper so I can assemble the pieces directly on top of the pattern. I'm using bits of scrap wood to make a really rustic looking shed. To avoid measuring, I'm making a pencil mark at the proper height that matches my pattern and cutting all the pieces to size. I'm trimming this piece of scrap from a miniature kit to make a window frame. Before gluing anything, I dry fit all the pieces to make sure they fit within the pattern. To add some more interest, I'm adding a bit of brown paint to look like stain or age on this board before I glue it to the piece beside it. All of the boards will be glued to one another, and any extra that squeezes onto the wax paper won't stick. This technique of assembling pieces over a pattern that's covered with wax paper could also be used to make miniature furniture. I'm making the side pieces wider so the walls won't be too shallow once I attach the thick wooden back piece. I assembled the rest of the pieces the same way by gluing strips of wood next to one another and following my pattern. I assembled the main body of the shed by gluing the side pieces to the back piece. I used the 3 walls to trace the shape of the floor onto some thin scrap wood from a miniature kit. This thin piece of wood is really plain, so I'm using a black Sharpie to add a miniature knot. I watered down some brown paint to stain the wood. I'm using black chalk pastels around the edges to make the wood look old and grimy. This detail is easier to add before gluing the floor in place. Before attaching the floor, I traced the shape of the roof onto some cereal box. The flat cereal box is pretty boring, so I'm adding some pieces of coffee stir stick to the ceiling for more texture and interest. I don't always show it, but I do remove any excess glue using a toothpick. To unify the stir sticks and cereal box, I gave the ceiling a coat of watered down brown paint. To add a bit of character to the doors, I'm using a pointy tool to make some holes where old nails might be. The holes are pretty hard to see, so I'm filling them with some black marker. I added some nail holes to the other door as well and inside of the shed. I'm using some rust effects to make little rust strips from each of the nails. Before I start gluing things to the walls, I'm using some black chalk pastels to add a shadow under the window frame and in all the corners. I cut a piece of popsicle stick to use as a desk and added a knot and some wood grain with a pointy tool. I aged the wood using paint and chalk pastels. I'm adding a stain using some paint on the end of a marker. This tabletop will be a great place to display some accessories, and it's making the shed a lot stronger. I stained some matchsticks and cut them at an angle to make it look like there are little brackets supporting the tabletop since it won't have any legs. I designed my doors a bit too short, so I'm adding some toothpick at the top and bottom to make them taller. I'm pretty used to coming up with fixes like this since I'm so averse to measuring. Now I can get to my favorite part, which is adding the little details. I cut out this pretty huge bag of grass seed from a local flyer. To make a miniature bag to attach it to, I cut a piece of paper towel, filled it with hot glue, and trimmed the edges. It's a great fit, so I'm adding some watered down glue and brown paint. I trimmed around just the words and glued it to the front of the bag. I love finding graphics from magazines and flyers because I'm pretty terrible with Photoshop. I've gotten so much use out of this aluminum tray lid, and now I'm using it to make a miniature paint can. I wrapped it around a wooden dowel and used white glue to secure it. I made a shiny bottom by using my Dollar Tree hole punch and some more aluminum. I filled it with some hot glue to make it sturdy and attached the little piece of metal. I added some more graphics from the same miniature flyer for the brand name. I made 3 paint cans, although I only end up using 2. For this can, I'm adding rust at the top and the bottom. I'm making this one look used by adding some paint around the top and bottom. I like when the accessories interact with the environment, so I added a paint spill to the tabletop and glued the can in place. To create the look of corrugated metal for the roof, I'm painting some cardboard with light gray paint and using a sponge to dab on silver. I cut out the shape of the roof, leaving some overhang, and I'm removing the other piece of paper as well, so the corrugation will be on the top and bottom, just like a real metal roof. I painted the underside to match and covered up the cereal box roof. I want this little shed to look like it lives outside, so I'm dabbing on some brown paint mixed with red to make it look rusty. Adding color to all the edges makes it look more realistic and adds definition. I added more rust effects, mainly concentrating on the edges. I'm using some aluminum foil and a fancy toothpick from Target to make a miniature bottle of paint. I'm wrapping the foil around the very top part of the toothpick and cutting this little notch out right below the curvy, fancy part. This makes up the bottle and a little lid. I'm adding color to the lid by dipping it in paint and using this little graphic as a label. This little bottle looks great in this quarter scale project, but would also work in a larger scale. Before I add accessories to the bottom, I'm adding a bit of dust and dirt in the corners. I got this sand from my yard and sifted out the big chunks. I'm making my first wall accessory, which is a place I can display some miniature tools from a Robin Betterly kit. I used a thumbtack, cardstock, and some brown and white paint to make a miniature pegboard for the wall. I glued a hand shovel to the pegboard, and I'm adding another piece to the window frame. The doors are a great place to display some more of the tools, so I'm adding a shovel and my favorite piece, which is this pair of clippers. I intended to add tiny nail heads so these tools aren't just floating on the doors, but I forgot to add that detail until after I took the final photos. To add some more color and interest to the walls, I'm cutting out a bunch of small brand names and making miniature signs. I'm gluing the pieces to a scrap of cereal box to give them some thickness. It's easier to attach them with overhang and cut out the shapes afterward. To hide the cereal box edges, I went around each of the signs with a marker. I'm using a tiny bit of white glue and a very shiny colored pencil to hold all of the signs while I add some more details. To give the impression of age and that these signs were collected over a number of years, I'm adding a bit of rust to all of the edges. I'm protecting each of the pieces with a product called Dimensional Magic, which is a lot like UV resin and Diamond Glaze. It dries to a nice shiny finish. Under the table is the only place the biggest sign will fit. I'm hovering it above the floor so it'll still be visible when I add more details in front of it. I'm using a button and a graphic from a Hobby Builder Supply magazine to make a miniature clock. I like how thin this button is because I think it'll look realistic in a quarter scale space. This project is inspired by Jolene of Tiny Keyhole Minis. She made a really cute button clock for the kitchen of her dollhouse. I'm using the local hardware store flyer to add little bits of paper to scatter over the tabletop. An easy and free detail like this adds realism and makes the miniature more interesting to look at. I used the tip of this fancy toothpick to make the short bottle, and now I'm using the rest of it to make a slightly taller bottle. I'm cutting up a piece of trash plastic to make some window glass. For a grimy and dirty window, I'm adding some Mod Podge mixed with brown paint and using my fingertip to dab it away. I want this paint can to live under the table, but it's a bit too big. I cut a piece away and I'm crushing it into a smaller size. To hide the bottom of the floating sign and add some brightness, I'm rolling a piece of the aluminum tray lid around an embroidery needle. I intentionally rolled it at a slight angle so the end is tapered and more interesting. I sanded some coffee stir stick and cut it into really thin pieces to make a tiny ladder. I'm using some tape and a small amount of glue to assemble the pieces for the ladder. I drew a simple pencil sketch onto the tape before I began assembly to make sure it'll fit underneath the table in the shed. To easily cut the correct angle for the two front pieces, I drew a straight line along the bottom and used my X-Acto to cut them in line. To turn these two separate tiny ladders into one step ladder, I'm gluing them both to a top piece. I mixed a little bit of glue into the paint to help the pieces stay together a bit better. I'm attaching a little square of white paper to make it look like a weight limit warning sticker and using more of the aluminum to make a bracket. I got these nail studs for your fingernails after watching Little Gretchen's bag series, and I'm using them to look like bolts attaching the hardware. I'm adding some rust effects and splattered paint to make it look like this ladder has been used. To make a chainsaw box, I glued some graphics to cereal box and cut out 2 rectangles. To make it easier to fold, I'm removing a tiny little wedge of cereal box on the back. When I fold this little flap, it makes the long side and a front of the box. I'm lining up the 2 sides to make sure the folds are in the same spot. To make assembly a breeze, I'm simply putting my L-shaped pieces of cardboard around a little pile of hot glue and then filling it the rest of the way. Once it's capped off with some more cereal box, I'm cutting all of the excess. Despite all the careful measuring I never did, the box is a bit too big, so I'm using my miter shears to trim it. Cutting through this hot glue was oddly satisfying. I cut the back corner at an angle to make it an even better fit and glued it in place. I'm using these terracotta molds I made way back when I created the 1/48 scale Witch's Cottage. I'm filling each of the molds with polymer clay and baking them in the oven at 275 for 15 minutes. For some of the pieces, I removed them with my Dollar Tree stylus before baking, and for others, I just baked them in my amazing mold putty molds. I glued a couple tiny notes to the window frame and added small beads to look like push pins. I'm using a similar technique I used to make the paint can to create a smaller can to sit on top of the table. I'm filling the can with some watch parts left over from my steampunk diorama. To avoid wasting watch parts, I filled the can mostly with glue. I added some gears around the room to look like saw blades. This little watch part kinda looks like a screwdriver, so I colored the handle red and glued it to the tabletop. It's such a tiny detail that you only notice when you really look. I made some faux hinges for the doors using black cardstock. These aren't functional hinges, so I'm gluing the doors in an open position using wood glue. To make the shed look like there's mildew growing around the bottom, I'm adding some watered down green paint. To help make the green paint a bit more vibrant against the dark wood, I mixed in a little bit of white acrylic paint. If you have some flocking, it's a really great tool to elevate your miniatures. I like to mix my flocking with glue and apply it by smearing it with my finger. It's so fun to apply this stuff, it can be easy to overdo it, so I added just a bit to the roof, the overhang, and a little bit around the mildewy base. I'm displaying my shed in a potted plant, so I cut some bamboo skewers and glued them to tape underneath the shed. Using the tape as a barrier makes it easy to remove the skewers in the future and protects the wood. I'm painting the skewers black and coating them with sealer to help prevent rot in the moist soil. I really enjoy projects like this where there are so many miniature makes from scratch. The tools are from a Robin Betterly 1/48 scale kit. Up next, I'm making some miniatures for my Goose Egg Dollhouse. I used egg cartons to make the faux stone floors, and now I'm using real cement to make tiles for the tabletop. I've modified this kit, so I'm cutting the sharp part off of this laser cut tabletop. I'm attaching some cardstock using double-sided flooring tape. The cardstock is adding a bit of overhang to the tabletop so I can fit more tiles. The table is flat across the front and curved along the back to fit on the inside of the eggshell. I'm using a cement product called Henry Feather Finish to make the tiles. I'm donning my dust mask and adding some of the cement to a plastic container I got recently with some takeout. This product is meant for skim coating and filling imperfections before a flooring installation. It's very easy to work with and forgiving. You can mix it to a really watery consistency that spreads nicely or keep it on the thicker side. This is pretty much the consistency of smooth peanut butter, so I'm ready to make my tiles. I found this silicone honeycomb textured pot holder at a Goodwill by the pound outlet. Being a miniaturist, I immediately thought of a way I could use it in miniatures as a mold for tiles. I'm trying to make sure each of the cavities is completely filled by making multiple passes from different directions. Feather finish will stick to vinyl, wood, and almost any surface, but it won't stick to silicone. The concrete dried in about 10 minutes and easily pops out of the silicone pot holder. For a different look, you could use tinted resin or clear resin to make glass tiles. This would be the perfect thickness for 1/12 scale, but for my 1/48 scale project, I sanded the tiles to make them much thinner and more in scale. I wore a mask throughout this dusty process and used a damp paper towel to remove the dust from the front and back of each tile. It only took a couple passes on the sandpaper to get the cement to the desired thinness. Even after sanding, the cement is still quite strong. I'm applying my first tile by lining up one of the straight hexagonal edges along the edge of the tabletop. I'm applying them in a honeycomb pattern, mimicking the pattern on the pot holder. The double-sided flooring tape is very sticky and easily holds the tiles. I applied the tiles, leaving overhang, and used a craft knife to cut the excess. Instead of making passes with the blade like you're cutting wood, just press the blade straight down to trim the excess. You could keep this industrial look, but I'm going for some color, so I tested 3 different colors of nail polish. The green and pink looked a bit too unnatural for me, so I went with this mauvey pink. I'll be adding grout, so I'm making sure to avoid the grout lines by tapping the nail polish brush on each of the tiles. If you try to apply the nail polish in a pulling motion like you would on your own fingernail, you may fill the gap in between the tiles. When you first pull the brush out of the bottle, there's too much polish on the brush, so I tap it on multiple tiles to distribute the polish, and then I tap each tile to make sure they get full coverage. With just one coat, there was a gray undertone from the cement, so I added a second coat. I'm not sure if it made a difference, but I covered each tile with a clear sealer to make them look even more like ceramic or porcelain. As a finishing touch, I added a couple layers of nail polish along the front, sides, and underside. The sealer has dried, so I'm grouting my tiles with some spackle. I'm using my finger to apply the spackle so I can smush it in between each of the tiles to make sure there are no dark gaps. I'm pressing firmly and wiping to fill all the spaces and to make cleanup a bit easier by having less spackle on the surface of the tiles. If you don't have spackle, you could also use plaster of Paris. I am absolutely loving how this is looking and imagine myself doing this for a 1/12 scale bathroom floor or kitchen backsplash. I drilled a hole in my paper tabletop to fit a fancy toothpick leg. The design is pretty boxy, so I'm using a cheap file to change the shape. I used a pencil to draw a line of the height of my table leg and one of my files to create a very nice taper. The toothpick was surprisingly strong, and I could see myself using the same technique to make 1/12 scale pegs or clothespins. I could have held it with tweezers, but instead I chased it around with some Waverly antique wax. Before allowing it to dry, I removed the excess wax with a paper towel. Most of the table will be glued to the inside of the egg, so there's only one leg. I attached it with some wood glue. I'm using some 10-count tapestry canvas to make a basket for the floor. I coated the canvas in white glue and clipped it to a handle to allow it to dry with a curved shape. A colored pencil was slightly too big, which is why I chose this handle. The shape doesn't look very organic, so I'm cutting a tiny bit off of each corner to make them more rounded. To make the handle, I pulled one of the threads out of the tapestry canvas. I cut it into 3 equal pieces and coated each strand with glue. Braiding the pieces can be a bit tricky, so I held the ends with a clip and pinned it down with a 1-2-3 block, which weighs 1 pound. I'm mimicking the look of a basket handle by tightly braiding the cord. Off camera, I added another layer of glue and wrapped it around a colored pencil to dry. Drying in this circular shape helps give me a nice small arched handle. I glued the handle on the inside of the basket. This basket would look really cute filled with a fringed blanket, but I've had this vintage miniature flower kit for some time. I read the instructions and referred to the sample flower and came up with my own method of assembly. I'm arranging some of the flowers on painter's tape, but first I reduced the stickiness by sticking the tape to my clothing. I'm storing all the excess flowers in this glass jar from the Dollar Tree. I'm adding black to the center of each flower, but instead of creating a perfect circle, I'm making a shaggy type of circle. These lines and pointed ends will be visible beyond the center dot. I dotted each of the centers with a cheap white gel pen from Temu. I added a layer of color with a Sharpie, but I preferred the vibrance of the white, so I fixed it. For my first attempt at shaping, I pressed the flower into some watered-down white glue with a ball stylus on a foam pad. The center dot completely disappeared and the marker became blurry. I changed tactic and instead sealed all of my flowers using some matte Mod Podge. This protects the paper and the colors I added and adds some stiffness for shaping. I'm removing a paper flower with my X-Acto knife and pressing it into my foam pad using my Dollar Tree ball stylus. You can press it into your hand instead if you don't have a foam pad. In this needle tip bottle I have some Beacon 3-in-1 glue, which is an acetone glue that's very similar to Fabri-Tac. I'm filling the basket with some forest moss to make it look like stems of flowers. I slightly overfilled the basket, so I'm trimming it so it looks less chaotic. Now it's a simple matter of gluing my flowers to the moss. I made more flowers than I need so I can use them again quickly in another project without having to assemble them. Baskets come in all shapes and sizes, so I think this would work in larger scales as well. I'm making a rug to add some color and softness to the faux stone floor. I chose this fabric because it frays nicely, so I'm tracing a slightly smaller oval onto some medical tape. I'm sticking the tape to the underside of the rug to keep the fraying in check. The tape will hold the fibers together anywhere it's in contact. I'm fraying the edges by pulling on the strings. If your fingernails aren't doing the trick, you can also use a sewing needle to separate the threads. Once all the edges are frayed, I trim off any excess. For a subtle and subdued pattern, I'm using watercolors to paint on some florals. I'm painting some very basic 5-petal flower shapes and adding some blobby leaves. I'm establishing a base layer of color and will add a tiny bit more detail on top once I dry it with a hairdryer. I used my gel pen to add the center dot to each of the flowers. I'm adding a tiny tinge of yellow to each of the dots with some watercolor paint. I don't want to add much darkness, but I am adding a tiny bit of definition to each of the petals with a little bit of a slightly darker shade of pink. This is sort of an impressionistic style of painting where your brain fills in some details that don't exist. One of the simplest things to make in any scale is a tiny vase of flowers using a bead. I chose this round wooden bead. I'm using some green flocking and a bit of this purple flower I got from a full-size faux flower arrangement. I am harvesting some of the purple styrofoam balls. Rather than sprinkling flocking onto glue, I prefer to mix the two because it creates a lot of dimension and doesn't come off once it dries. I added some additional glue for security and plopped my flocking pile on top. I tried sprinkling the styrofoam balls on the wet flocking, but it didn't work very well, so I decided to roll it around instead. I covered most of the flocking this way, but then for more precise placement, I added little tiny dots of glue and small styrofoam balls in select places. Sticking my stylus in the bead hole was an easier way to manage this tiny bead rather than using tweezers. I have a nice collection of tiny bells and would like to make a dinner bell for the egg house. I was planning to use this bracket, but it's way too big for this project. This tiny broken piece of wire wicker furniture is a much better scale. This will look pretty cute hanging outside of the egg house, but it needs some modifications first. I'm sanding the bit of metal so I can create a larger surface area for gluing. I'm using a bit of cardstock to act as a metal bracket. You can use super glue, but I like to avoid it, so I'm just using white glue. To unify these pieces and help the paint stick, I'm coating them with Ultra Matte from Duraclear. This is the same product I used to coat glass so Rub and Buff would stick. It creates a slight texture on the surface that helps paint grab. To mimic the look of iron, I painted the bracket black and used antique gold rub and buff on the bell. The brass bell looked a bit too vibrant, so the rub and buff tones it down nicely. I'm adding a tiny bit of black around the rim for the slightest hint of patina. To make this painted bracket look more like wrought iron, I'm starting with a coat of matte sealer. Once that dries, I'm adding a coat of watered down white paint. I dab away the excess and let it dry, and I'm left with this dusty black tone. The white paint pigments got caught in the minimal texture of the matte sealer. Try this technique on some fireplace tools or a miniature fence to make them look like wrought iron. Now I'm making a corner shelf for the cardboard room box. I absolutely love avoiding doing measuring and math around here, so to quickly and easily get the correct angle for the corner shelf, I'm using a couple pieces of scrap mat board. While the mat board was in place on the wall, I made a faint pencil mark to make sure it doesn't project too far and hit the chair. These paper pieces won't make up any of the shelving, I'm just using this as a pattern. My corner shelf will have 3 shelves, so I'm making sure my pattern piece fits on each level of the wall. I traced around my piecemeal pattern to make a new pattern piece. I got this piece of wood from Earth and Tree Miniatures in a bundle of wood that only cost $1. I love how rustic it looks with the visible knots, so I'm laying my template on the pieces to make sure I capture the best knots in my shelves. I'm angling the front of the shelves to add support pieces. To avoid doing math, I traced the size of the angled cut I just made onto a scrap piece of wood and traced it onto the other side. I would normally line the shelf up with the cut end I made, but I really want this knot on one of my shelves, so I'm centering my shelf over my favorite knot. The shelf will have a top shelf, a middle shelf, and a bottom shelf, so to make them all about the same size, I'm holding them together and using my metal file. Again, to avoid measuring, I cut a strip of paper and laid the shelves in the space to get an idea of how long I need my 2 side support pieces to be. This is more wood I got in a $1 bundle, and I'm making it look a little bit more rustic by shaving off some of the sides with my X-Acto. I'm cutting 2 support pieces for the shelf. Since this corner shelf will be glued to the wall, I'm using the wall itself as the back of the shelf. The shelf itself will only be made of 5 pieces in total, the 3 shelves and the 2 support pieces. The shelf will be really flimsy until it's glued into the space, so I'm using some painter's tape and my 1-2-3 blocks as a jig to help me build it. As a simple way to make sure the shelves are level, I'm using a square magnet to make sure there's a perfect square between the supporting side piece and the shelf. In my jig, the piece of painter's tape is acting like the right side of the wall in the corner. I allowed the wood glue to dry for just a few minutes before gently removing the tape. I'm using a tiny dot of super glue to reinforce every joint. I added wood glue to all the parts of the shelf that'll be in contact with the wall and glued it in place. I'm making the first accessory for the shelf using a piece of trash I found on the sidewalk.
As some of you know, I have a curious habit of collecting trash. I found this little treasure on a walk, and I think it's a wire insulator because it's squishy and hollow. I got this jar of buttons at an antique store, and I'm going to combine a few of them with my sidewalk trash to make a milk can. These 3 buttons I planted here will be perfect. For step 1, I'm stiffening it up with some tissues. I'm compacting the tissue to get rid of the air between them so it'll be nice and stiff to keep it from squishing. I'm using this button as the lid of the milk can because it has a little metal part at the top that looks like a handle. To add some structure to the bottom of the can, I found a button with the same diameter as the insulator. I'm gluing a larger button under the inside button to make a rim for the bottom of the jug. I carried this home in my pocket and I've handled it a whole bunch, but I'm finally cleaning it now because it's actually pretty dirty. It's probably best practice to clean your sidewalk trash shortly after bringing it home. I'm lightly sanding the whole thing to prepare it for paint and also so the paper details I add will stick. In my last video, some viewers gave me helpful advice on how to use your fingernail to curl a piece of paper. I'm using the strip of scrap cardstock around the bottom as a rim. I'm cutting a tinier strip to use to make the 2 handles. I made sure the seam of the bottom piece of paper is at the back, so I want to put the 2 handles on what will be the sides. At this small of scale, cardstock peels up in layers, so once the glue has set a little bit, I'm using my tweezers to pull off some of the bulk. To smooth out the paper and give it some strength, I'm covering it with wood glue. I'm using this container in the kitchen that says salt in German, so I'm Googling some images of antique German milk jugs to paint my jug. I don't do much miniature painting, so it's a lot easier for me to work from a reference image than making something up. I settled on this design with scalloping at the top and some flowers in the middle. I'm doing a very simple sketch to lay out my flowers to make it easier to paint them on. I'm not a painting expert and this isn't really a tutorial, but my thought process is to lay down some colors and add some small details on top to make it look more refined. The jug I'm copying has green pieces framing the flowers, so I'm adding that now. I keep referencing the image on Google, and there are green leaves surrounding the flowers, so I'm adding some of those now. The green scalloped border is dry, so I'm using some yellow ochre to outline it. I'm adding more detail to the blue flower by giving it a yellow ochre center. I'm using some more yellow ochre to make a thin line inside of all of the green details on the border. To make the flowers look like flowers and give the petals some definition, I'm making a few simple lines using some white. The Google jug has some green in the flowers, so I'm adding that now as some more contrast to make them pop. I'd like to replicate some of the tiny leaves, but I'm not sure how it'll turn out, so I'm practicing first on the back before I add it to the front. I finished off the rest of the leaves, and now I'm testing some brown chalk pastels on the back to see how it looks for aging. Here's the finished jug. I think in the future I'll hold things in place with tacky wax until I can decide on a final position, because now the wooden utensils on the wall are hanging too low.
Now I'm using a bunch of odd bits and bobs to make some industrial light fixtures. I'm using suction cups, beads, and plastic caps. Cleaning the pieces with rubbing alcohol will help the paint stick. I should have done this prior to cleaning them, but I removed these weird little nibs that are on each suction cup and trimmed the top of a suction cup that was too tall. Since this is just soft rubber, it's really easy to trim it with some pliers. To further prep for paint, I'm adding paper to the top of the suction cups using Beacon 3-in-1. This is an acetone-based glue that's very similar to Fabri-Tac. I used the acetone-based glue to stick the paper to the rubber and used white glue to glue the paper to itself. I wrapped the paper around itself a couple of times. I'm prepping the third suction cup by cutting off this angled top piece that used to have this metal piece attached. This kind of bows outward like a tapered lampshade, so I'm trimming it so it's flatter. I'm filling the gap where the metal hook used to be with jute rope so the paper has something to stick to. Now all three suction cups are clean and have paper caps and are nearly ready to paint, but I would like to prep them using some Ultra Matte. This matte sealer has a bit of tooth, so it'll help the acrylic paint I'll be using stick to these suction cups. Don't run out and buy everything you see me use, because there are often substitutes, like in this case you could use matte Mod Podge or primer. When I added my paper caps, I left excess because it's easier for me to trim them to size, and I like to avoid measuring. I'm trimming the paper to be flush with the top of the suction cup. You could trim them before you apply the sealer, but I forgot. I'm adding more details to the top of the lights, starting with some tape that's meant for your fingernails. This tape is really thin, but it will add dimension to tiny miniatures. I'm adding the tape at the very top and doubling it up for added dimension. The adhesive on this tape is pretty questionable, so when I added an additional piece to the bottom, I decided to use some white glue to help it stick a bit better. Subsequent layers of paint will help this stick as well, but I don't want it budging before that step. For my smallest suction cup, I'm cutting a much wider trim using some adhesive label leftovers. Adding small details helps make your miniatures look more realistic. This looks like a pilgrim hat, but not for long. I added a layer of nail tape along the bottom, but I wanted something more dimensional, so I chose this round green string. I used the same string on the third suction cup. I'd like to add a domed top to the suction cups to break up all the clean lines, so I'm slightly melting a hot glue stick over an open flame. The jumbo stick works well for 2 of the suction cup lights, but I need a small mini stick for the third light. I slightly melted the ends of the glue sticks over an open flame by keeping them moving, and now I'm trimming off the domes using an X-Acto knife and a cutting mat. I melted both ends of the big stick to get 2 domes. I'm cleaning up my rough cut and melting the bottom of the glue stick so it'll stick to the suction cup. On my first attempt, I tried to remove the pin prematurely, so make sure you allow the domes to cool in place so you don't misshapen the soft glue. I attached the dome to the smallest suction cup using this clear gel tacky glue from Aleene's, which is pretty similar to 3-in-1 in Fabri-Tac but costs half the price. Now that the dome is in place on this large suction cup, I used some string to hide the seams and add additional dimension. I added the string using either Aleene's or Fabri-Tac and glued the ends together with white glue. You can hardly see this detail in the end, but I also added some really tiny crochet thread to flank this little piece of nail tape. I'm really antsy to paint these bad Larrys, but first I need to drill a hole in each of the light fixtures. I wasn't drilling for very long, but the bit did get warm enough to melt the hot glue. I let it cool down and peeled off the cold hot glue. The hole kind of automatically caved in on itself, so I ended up using a toothpick to force the holes to be bigger. To electrify these lights, you could use a lighting kit like these I got from Evan Designs. This is the chip light size. These are battery-powered LED lighting kits. You could also use some string fairy lights if you're patient enough and so inclined. Before you even dream of adding the lights, it's time for paint. These suction cups are made of flexible rubber, so I wasn't sure how they would take acrylic paint, but they painted up nicely. I am using higher quality acrylic paint from Vallejo, so I'm not sure how cheap craft paint would do. I painted the inside of the shade white and the outside green. I'm holding it while it dries using some Dollar Tree clips. All of the fixtures will be white on the inside and a different color on the outside. I'll be painting this fixture silver, but instead of doing my usual black base coat, I opted for brown, so it'll hopefully be a warmer, more natural silver tone. I'm using Silver Leaf Rub and Buff for the color because I like the realistic luster. I'm applying it with a Q-tip to keep my paws clean and because I haven't figured out how to clean Rub and Buff out of a paintbrush. I'm not sure if the brown base coat made a difference since Rub and Buff is so opaque, but I do like the outcome. This looks positively lovely, so I'm going to muck it up with some Rustall. It didn't come with instructions, so maybe I'm using it wrong, but I don't see any advantage over using this product versus just watering down some red ochre paint. The super smooth surface of the Rub and Buff resisted the Rustall, but it did create this patchy appearance that makes it look more authentic. For some realistic rust texture, I'm adding some white glue and sprinkling on some cinnamon. Lots of people have used this trick, but I've seen Whitney LeBray use it in particular on her miniature channel, and I always love the outcome. Adding a coat of watered down red ochre paint and covering it with some glue and cinnamon would be a nice cheap way to create rust. I'll be adding rust effects from Dirty Down Rust, which is my favorite product for creating realistic rust. My small bottle of Dirty Down Rust cost $28, but I have had it for years and I haven't found a product that rivals it. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but from what I can understand, this product creates a chemical reaction that makes real rust. It rinses easily off of a brush using just water, so I'm using a brush to add small amounts around the outside edges of the cinnamon. For this next light fixture, I decided to try using nail polish on the outside. You'd think I would have tested this off camera, but I did not, and unfortunate things did happen. I started by adding one coat of white to the inside and covered the entire outside of the shade with some red nail polish. The first coat of paint was too transparent and the second coat caused some warping. That kind of warp could work for a wabi-sabi light fixture or a floppy hat, but not for a metal industrial light, so I cleaned it off with nail polish remover to start afresh. I'm coating the inside with white and covering up the black strip that wasn't well covered when I was using the nail polish. This time I'm using Testor's acrylic paint. I accidentally got this paint when I was looking to buy enamel paint, but it ends up working out really well for this project. Just like Testor's enamel paint, the acrylic paint has great coverage and is shiny. I was surprised and delighted that the warp went away completely shortly after I removed the nail polish. To add some shine to the plain acrylic paint, I'm adding a coat of Diamond Glaze. I'm not sure this was the right product since the brush left a lot of streaks, but it did add shine. If you'd like to make these functional, you'd add your wires at this point once you've completed painting them, but I'm using these as dummy lights. To add string for hanging, I added white glue to the hole and pressed the string in place. I have a little hoard of strings I've gotten mainly from price tags. In addition to adding a cord or a string, you could also use beads to cap off the top for additional detail. I ended up removing this bead, but now I kind of like it now that I see it during editing, but I think this looks like a ceramic light fixture socket like you'd see on a retro lamp. I usually specifically choose the next video you get to see, but I'm letting YouTube decide, so let me know how they do. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month.